On Story is brought to you in part by the Alice Kleberg Reynolds Foundation, a Texas family providing innovative funding since 1979. From Austin Film Festival, this is On Story, a look inside the creative process from today's leading writers, creators, and filmmakers. This week's On Story, 11/22/63 creator and writer Bridget Carpenter, and Mad Men writer Carly Wray.
Thinking about stories in the past, the first thing to think about is how are they relevant to the present? You're going to weave in all sorts of elements about an era that is not your own that will be interesting or intriguing or shocking, but the first thing to lead with is who are the people in that world, in that era that you're telling a story about, and what in their humanity and their day-to-day experiences am I going to be able to relate to?
In this episode, Bridget Carpenter and Carly Wray explore the challenges writers face when tasked with telling stories set in a different time period.
Well, I'll say one thing that was very much the ethos on Mad Men, and that was that thinking about stories in the past, the first thing to think about is how are they relevant to the present? The idea isn't just, oh, here's going to be a history lesson. We're going to look back at a fascinating time in history, and we're just simply going to sit back and appreciate it, or think it's weird, or be like, oh, the doctors are smoking. How that's wacky. Look at how badly the women are being treated. You're going to weave in all sorts of elements about an era that is not your own that will be interesting or intriguing or shocking, but the first thing to lead with is who are the people in that world, in that era that you're telling a story about, and how, what in their humanity and their day-to-day experiences am I going to be able to relate to? I think that you can watch Mad Men and realize that you're not just watching an experience that's case in glass and has nothing to do with working in a workplace in 2018.
For 11/22/63, which was a very particular adaptation, it was not only, so I would say that for me, the end was part of the story of the protagonist, Jake, was about finding a portal back to time and falling in love with the past. So I also, in reading the book, fell in love with the story, and so wanted to, my way in a sort of visual and visceral way was, well, what are the things about the past, almost in an opposite way, that are different from now that you would experience an explosion of love and being there. And it also had to be with that grounded. So unlike, say, Maisel, Mrs. Maisel, the fabulous Mrs. Maisel, that show now, which if you turn it on, the style and the production design of it, it just looks like a beautiful advertisement. It's a bandbox. It's exquisite looking. 11/22/63, my cinematographer and director, my first director, Kevin McDonald, and I wanted to create a world that was of the past that was like documentary. So I was like, I want to feel like you're in 1960. So we have to spray dust on the cars, not have a bunch of shiny, gorgeous cars, which everybody in production wants to do because they look so amazing. And I said, we have to have people who actually wear clothes more than once. We have to have fashions that are not of 1960, but maybe they bought it in 1958 and they're wearing it now. So we approached it with a really particular eye to both documentary, but something that would be visually, we wanted beautiful cinematic naturalism.
What's the relationship between being so attention to detail in the visuals with the writing?
Well, I would say probably the most explosive, meaningful place in that story having to do with both what the story was is not only does Jake go into the past, he goes into the past with the express goal of preventing the assassination of John F. Kennedy. So we ended up recreating the day of the assassination in Dealey Plaza. We shot Dealey Plaza. We had 600 extras in vintage clothes. We had the presidential motorcade. We did research into what cars would be in what order. Our costumer, Roland Sanchez, took the Zapruder film of the assassination of JFK, blew up film stills, and meticulously recreated 50 costumes from those film stills. We recreated that's the story. The story is we're stepping into an actual thing of the past. And the other thing that we did that was, just thrilling as a storyteller and daunting, and made me feel like allegiance, because this is something that happened in many of our, not in my lifetime, but in my parents' lifetime. There are people who are alive that remember this. And so we had permission from the rights holders of the Zapruder film if we wanted to reuse that film within our storytelling. What we also did was shoot our own Zapruder film. So we used that camera and we shot what happened, and that is the footage that we ended up using in our storytelling. So the kind of meticulous recreation felt, again, really bound into the storytelling of that story, again, because you're leading up inexorably to an event that was a real event, but we are utterly fictionalizing another ending to that event. So it was kind of like, be original and have great fidelity to the design of that.
Is there another element where you feel a responsibility to the events, to the people involved, versus sort of taking more creative license?
It's a tricky one. I feel like you want to take an honest approach to what you're doing, and you want to take it seriously, particularly if you're writing about people who are still here and alive and active and will be able to engage with the story. That feels like you have an extra level of responsibility to get that story right, which is not to say to please those people or to hide truth to make them look better. It's not a PR piece for people who are living if you are telling their story. I think you have a duty to not misrepresent anything fundamental. But I think it is a dance then to decide if you are going to have to take creative license here or there about how certain event, what the order of certain events was. You just have to approach with caution and respect for the people that you're writing about, and kind of still the goal of telling the greater truth, remaining in service of the greater truth about the people you're writing about.
What do you think is the draw? Why are people still interested in these stories, in historical things or in period things? Is it a kind of nostalgia for a different time, a different place, and being able to inhabit that space?
I'm wary of nostalgia. I love emotion, and I even love melodrama, but I don't love nostalgia.
Right.
And in fact, we talked about that a great deal in terms of our design. I would say that for me, I'm not drawn to material particularly because if it's of a time. I loved this story, and I felt like I understood why this story needed to be in the past and what a character was searching for. So it was, for me, just fulfilling that drive. I think you're right to bring up the word nostalgia. Because I think it's, it's an axe. There's something that's...
Yeah, I have a...
We all want to say that
it's
so much easier. it's so time was so simple then. I'm like,
Yeah,
right,
no,
before civil
that's-
rights,
yeah.
it was so simple. There's
Yeah.
a mistake, like, so I am really reluctant to go like, what a simpler, more beautiful time.
Yeah.
I think that's up.
Yes.
That's up.
It's
Come on.
that's a very nostalgia is
times
very
when-
toxic in that
Yeah.
regard, because it's very it erases a lot of
Right.
life and a lot of complexity. And that was also an ethos on Mad Men, is that the goal is not to make it, you shouldn't be watching the show thinking like, oh, amazing, you're drinking at work, the furniture is beautiful, like everyone's having a hard time.
I bet daily friendship with that bottle attracts more people to advertising.
That's why I got in.
So enjoy it.
Doing my best here.
You're not.
It was never supposed to be, look at this simpler time. And also, one of the challenges, I think, was Matthew Weiner would always say, these characters did not watch a documentary about the 60s. Like, they're not all talking about the things that have been distilled down as important about the 60s in 2016. You know, Betty Draper she doesn't give a shit about Woodstock. You know, like, by characters. Like, there's all sorts of stuff happening in the world right now that will be written about 40 years from now that you weren't talking about in your daily life, that wasn't on your radar. So this flattening of the past into like, oh, the 60s meant these 10 things and these 10 songs, and they meant them in the same intensity to everybody, is just like, no, if you're going to go to that era, it's interesting to go tell the truth of the people in that era. And there's also a tendency to have stereotypes looking back of like, well, okay, but a housewife in that era couldn't do XYZ. And you're like, well, okay, but what if this one housewife did? Because there were individuals who had, their own orientations to the social mores of the time. So I'm only interested in period if you're actually going into that period and telling interesting and rich character stories. I'm super interested if it's exploding nostalgic cliche. I love that. But otherwise, I'm only going to be drawn into the idea of a show for behind a character. And if that character happens to exist in another time, then great.
Was there any particular episode or scene or something in Mad Men that made you, that you were sort of like, felt the most either challenged by or connected to, that dealt with something that would have been specific to a past moment?
I mean, in terms of looking at those stories and being there while they were being written and feeling connected. I mean, the magic, I think, of Mad Men was to make it feel almost like you're watching a beautiful piece of art, but you're also connecting to the characters on a number of levels. And I mean, I was a staff writer on that show, and so connected very simply to Peggy, who starts her first day in the pilot, and you can see her already grating against the order that's being laid out for her. And I always really appreciated, like, I related to Peggy without having anything actually in common with her. I related to her POV. And in the early episodes of season 1, you're watching the women actually represent a spectrum of points of view. And so it's, instead of it just being this monolithic, like, oh, the secretarial pool is one thing and then the housewife is one thing, I really connected to and appreciated that there are moments where you understand Joan's hostility or Joan's, sexuality or, Joan's desires, Joan's orientation to power, and then Peggy's orientation to power. And so those were things, as a young person who was trying to build a career in the entertainment industry, I really connected to and appreciated that there was, such a multiplicity of angles on that experience represented in this one show in an era that I was before I was born.
Did you have a similar experience on either 11/22/63 or one of the other projects where there was a challenge relating directly to sort of the historicity or the period quality of the material?
I think I stole my attitude from something that I heard Francis Ford Coppola say. And he was talking about making The Godfather, and he said whenever he was unsure about how to stage a scene, he would go back to the theme, what he felt in his heart what the theme was, and he would go, oh, I'm just going to do the theme. And I felt really strongly about writing this, piece that ended up being, had a beginning, middle, and an end, that anytime I felt lost, or I wasn't sure, I didn't immediately see a path in terms of the historicity and getting that particular bit right, I would remember that the story is about an ordinary man in the time that I'm from who wanted to make a difference. And that dictated. That was kind of my own beacon. And so then things became easy and clear. He thinks he's going to go back to the past and make a difference because he's going to save Kennedy. And surprise, it is not that makes a difference in his world.
Is theme something that you feel like the story can start from naturally? If your idea comes from the idea that you read a newspaper article about this, something that happened in 1948, then that seems like a specific sort of moment in time with a certain event. How do you find the connection to tie theme into event?
I think I would, rather than going straight to theme, I would go to character and what that character wants. So this character wants to make a difference. He's got a specific goal in mind as to how to do that, I guess, at a certain point. But if I read an article about, okay, here was an interesting labor movement that happened. Here was an interesting labor riot that happened, and I'm curious about that. What an interesting world that is. Or I'm interested in the palace intrigue of X era. You could become interested in a time period because you think it's lusciously beautiful, or because you think that it's distressingly filthy or distressingly corrupt. And I think that's great. That's a totally wonderful place to start, that's a world you want to go and explore. And so for me, the way you figure out how to turn that into a show is, who is the person living in that world, and what do they want when I meet them? And that what they want could be something that is very much tied to the, if you do research about, if you pick, a priest in the 1400s, you could do some research about that to figure out like what those guys could even possibly have wanted. Maybe it's something he's not supposed to have because of his religion. And then pick, his want could also have something to, he wants the girl up the block to fall in love with him. There could be a very universal want that could happen in any era ever. It's really up to you. But that's where I would begin. That's the heart of the story. And then how that want gets pursued and where the obstacles come from can be very much tied to the obstacles that are inherent to the time that you're writing in. But and theme for me kind of then comes next after you decide what that want is. That would be my approach.
I think there may be something wrong with this world.
No choice you ever made was your own. You have always been a prisoner. What if I told you I'm here to set you free?
Are we very old friends?
No, I wouldn't say friends, Dolores. I wouldn't say that at all.
You're playing with this idea of a simulacrum, a sort of a false world that has connections to the past but is completely synthetic. So what are the challenges in writing on that project? I know you both were on the show at different times, but talk about some of the challenges of what I would call sort of inventive history.
One of the things that we always defaulted back to, I was on season 2, so this was inherited wisdom from season 1, but one of the lenses that we really had to apply, particularly in the designing of the Ghost Nation. So, Ghost Nation was kind of a background player in season 1. We wanted to bring them forward in season 2, and we were kind of ramping up to an episode that would be all in Ghost Nation. And so we had to sit around and talk about, okay, well, how did Ford approach designing these guys? We're not designing these guys. We have a character who is the designer of these characters. What would
he's
his
80.
And he's 80.
And
He's 80.
white. Yeah.
He's a white British, elderly man who had fantasies of the American West. So you kind of have to come through that lens first, instead of like, okay, would he have tried to be meticulously accurate? Sure. Is he going to change things because he has a zest for putting on a show? Absolutely. So what are those fudged details going to look like? What fudged details would this 80-year-old British white man, make? And in a certain degree, there was an interesting, would they have been the most respectful depictions of Native Americans if the point of them in this park is to be game fodder?
Savages.
Yeah, they're the savages. You can go play those narratives. So it was a really interesting, tricky dance to say, okay, we're working inside an American historic paradigm, but it's being recreated through a specific lens in a theme park for a specific reason. So you kind of invent a hybrid of the textural details, getting the textural details correct, and then inventing a little bit of razzle dazzle that's coming from one particular impresario.
I will say that just about Westworld in general, created by Lisa Joy and Jonah Nolan, is by far the most intellectual show that I had ever worked on. Mm-hmm. It was so for season 1, which I came in late to, so I could take very little credit. I'll take no credit. It was just a pleasure to be around all of these brilliant people putting this together. I felt like the questions that they were asking and the writers' room were posing were not so much about the past, but about consciousness. And it was about what is the birth of consciousness, what is the birth of humanity. So the past, honestly, from my point of view, was incidental. The past was all in the design. The design was taking care of that. The questions that were kind of actively struggled with on a writing level were about consciousness and what that meant, and therefore character.
It's interesting to think about the conversation about the past in the context of Westworld. It becomes...
It's a fake past.
It's a fake past, but it becomes a conversation about how memory functions.
Yes.
For each individual character, what it means to be remembering the past, and having that come into their presence, that it's in fact the ability to remember the past is very tied into the awakening of their consciousness. Like having access to their memories is what makes them come into full consciousness. So there are, in the process of The Room absolutely starts at a very intellectual level of theories of the mind, theories of consciousness, arguments about free will, and whether or not humans actually have
stories
it.
of myth, the idea of the Ouroboros, right, of a snake eating its own tail. So you're going from things that have existed for many, ideas and pictographs that have existed for many people for a long time, and going, let's pick it apart, and what does it mean in terms of rigorous storytelling that actually really moves as a script.
Do you feel like anything about writing historical pieces lends itself more to kind of taking a mythological approach, seeing sort of these motifs that get repeated culturally throughout history and applying that to a story that you're telling that might even have happened 20 or 30 years ago, or something that's happened in the Middle Ages? Or
I don't think I would say yes, the past lends itself to that kind of way in. I find my own totems, so for,
That's a good way to say it.
So I think for 11/22/63, there was a Robert Frank book of photographs called The Americans that was my touchstone. And in filming it, I knew that I was going to recreate several photographs from that book and put it in a thing. And it doesn't matter whether anybody ever sees or notices. That was for me. They were my totems.
Ready? No.
I think that there's great value in myth and repetitive storytelling, and I think find your totems.
You've been watching Portals to the Past on OnStory. On Story is part of a growing number of programs in Austin Film Festival's On Story project, including the On Story PBS series, now streaming online, the On Story radio program, the On Story podcast, and the On Story book series, available where books are sold. To find out more about On Story and Austin Film Festival, visit onstory.tv or austinfilmfestival.com.